Afternoon, everybody. Really lovely to see you. Thank you so much for joining us at the St. Nick's Talks this lunchtime, either here in person, as a few are, or others watching online. Thanks so much for giving up your time this lunchtime. If we've not met before, my name's Tom. I'm part of the staff team that helps to run these talks. And as I say, it's wonderful to have you with us. The St. Nick's Talks exist to give people based in this part of the City of London the opportunity to explore the claims of the Christian faith. Week by week, we have a short talk from the Bible. Today, our talk is on the topic, is faith just a leap in the dark? I'm going to be speaking. If you're here in the room, you'll see that there are some paper handouts scattered around, which have the points that I'm going to be making on them. If you're watching online, you can find that same handout available on our website, and that might be a useful thing to have at your disposal. Is faith just a leap in the dark? It's a good question to ask, isn't it? The various celebrity atheists of our age love to say that faith is just guesswork. Richard Dawkins, faith is the great cop-out, the great excuse to evade the need to think and evaluate evidence. Christopher Hitchens, faith is the surrender of the mind. It's the surrender of reason. It's the surrender of the only thing that makes us different from other animals. Peter Singer, what is faith? Well, if you believe something because you have evidence for it or rational argument, that is not faith. Faith is believing something despite the absence of evidence or rational argument for it. Knowing a while ago that I was going to be giving this talk, I got in touch with a handful of old school friends. Now, we didn't go to a particularly religious school. I guess we were fairly normal in that respect. But here's what one of them said he thought I meant when I spoke to him about the Christian faith. Following your heart rather than your head. Holding a belief despite a lack of evidence. Having some hope which may or may not come true. Faith is something that's very personal. Well, at a time in our history when we're asking big questions, at a time we want hope, and we want some real concrete certainty, I want to say that as a Christian believer, those are not definitions that I recognise. Far from faith springing from a total lack of evidence, the Christian faith is totally grounded in it. It's a response to all the actions of a remarkable human being. It's reasonable, it's rational, it gives us hope for all eternity. And I hope this lunchtime to just begin to persuade you of that by looking at just two verses from John's Gospel. John's Gospel, one of the earliest recorded biographies of Jesus. It was written by somebody who knew him very well. And I thought that we'd look at just a couple of verses that if you're watching online, you could very easily find on the internet. John chapter 20, verses 30 to 31. And then I've got two things I'd like to say in answer to this question. So let me read them. John chapter 20, verses 30 to 31. And actually they're printed on the handout if you're able to see that. Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book, that is John's Gospel. But these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. Here's the first thing I want to point out from these verses, and it's this. The Christian faith is faith on the basis of evidence. That the man we know as Jesus really walked upon the earth is widely accepted by secular historians. Several writers from the time record the influence of Jesus, despite not sharing any kind of party allegiance, despite not being Christian themselves, despite actually not being very sympathetic to Christians. If you were to Google books from the period, you might find something written by Josephus or Tacitus or Pliny the Younger, all non-Christian first century historians, all of whom make reference to the person of Jesus. But the book that I've just read to you from, John's Gospel, is an eyewitness testimony of one of his closest disciples. Verse 30, Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and by believing you may have life in his name. The author of these books is a man named John. He tells us later that he's one of Jesus' closest disciples. He's someone who lived with him, who listened to him, who watched him for something like 3 calendar years. Now, he's not claiming to have written an exhaustive history. Verse 30, he says he's been selective. Interestingly, he's not actually claiming to be free from bias. Verse 31, he's written with a purpose, as do all historians, as actually do all philosophers. But he's claiming quite plainly to have witnessed events which suggest something major about Jesus. He's claiming, put simply, to have seen Jesus do things which demonstrate that he's the Christ, God's Son on earth. One of the books that I've most enjoyed reading over these last few lockdown months is this book by a guy named Peter Williams, which we've got copies of over there on the bookstall. Now, Peter Williams works over at Tyndale House in Cambridge. He's got a PhD from the university. And in his book entitled Can We Trust the Gospels, he has a chapter called Did the Gospel Authors Know Their Stuff? You know, are the Gospels, as we find them today, reliable history? Here are some of the topics that he covers. Geography, quote, all writers display knowledge of a range of localities from well-known through lesser-known to obscure. If you were to read through John's Gospel, which you could very easily do, you could grab a copy at the back or you could find it online, you would find any number of specific geographical details. Names of places which are very rarely heard of outside Israel: Cana, Anan, Sychar. Names of rivers, lakes, tributaries, names of mountains, hills, and villages. Any number of bits of geographical detail. Topography, quote, all 4 Gospels know that travelling to Jerusalem, elevation of about 750 metres, is correctly described as going up. In John 2, the journey from Cana of Galilee to Capernaum is described as going down. The location of Cana is disputed, but the lowest of the candidates is an elevation of about 200 metres. Capernaum is 200 metres below sea level. How do you explain details like that? And how do you explain it if the gospel writers didn't actually know their stuff? Geography, topography, horticulture. Quote, the gospel writers often mention details that aren't recorded in any other books. For example, 2 specific gardens are mentioned, namely Golgotha and Gethsemane. As there are no other surviving contemporary records of these place names, it's unlikely gospel writers had access to books so they could copy them. However, their particular linguistic shapes betray knowledge of Judea and its languages. The gospel writers just knew their stuff. If we had more time, we could think about botany. Where do fig or olive trees grow in Israel? Finance. What are the units of currency? Who collects tax in a particular district? Local language, local customs, onomastics, that is the study of people's names. Which names come up frequently? Which names have to be disambiguated because they're so common? Names like John. Which kind of names are unusual or unique? You know, if you're here today or you're watching as someone who has dismissed the Gospels as being ahistorical, I'd really encourage you just to take one and to read it. Speaking from personal experience for a moment, I can say that the more familiar that I have become with the Gospels, the more persuaded I have become that they are true. They are real life history. eyewitness testimony. They're legally admissible evidence, if you want to put it like that. It's worth noting, of course, the sheer boldness of this claim. Verse 30, Jesus did many signs in the presence of his disciples. Of all of the miracles that Jesus did, very few of them took place in private. They were public. They were obvious. They were open for other people to see. 5,000 fed, a wedding party salvaged, healings in the temple on a Saturday. The place would have been absolutely rammed. What John has recorded are public events. If you had been there, you would have seen them. The Christian faith is based around evidence. It's not just a leap in the dark. But here's the second thing I want to say, and it's also down there on the handout. The Christian faith is faith about the identity of a person. Verse 30 again, Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing, you may have life in his name. I'm told it's very difficult to ever prove a negative. So to prove, for example, that there is no monkey in this room. Now, you can't see one, I shouldn't have thought. I can't see one. But it could be that there's one in here that we just haven't noticed, right? All we can say with any degree of certainty is that if there is a monkey here, none of us have been able to see it. Now, it's hard as well, I think, to make kind of great assessments of any truths that are necessarily subjective. Hamsters are horrible. Chocolate is great. Winter is wonderful, even if you're in Scotland. You know, we tend to say that things like that are just matters of opinion. They're debatable. Issues of preference, basically unimportant. But when it comes to making judgments about a person, their authority and their identity, I want to suggest we make those kind of judgments all the time, and we make them with quite a high degree of confidence. They're objective. They're either right or wrong. When a police car pulls up alongside our car at the lights, why do we immediately put our phone away, other than the fact that it's illegal? Oh, well, it's because a police car contains a policeman, and a policeman has authority to arrest you. By assessing all of the evidence of the flashing lights and sirens, we very quickly make a judgment about the person, their importance. The Christian is the person who follows all the evidence and reaches a conclusion about Jesus. Not a fool who throws out reason, not who's led less by head than by heart. The Christian is the person who follows all of the evidence and reaches a firm conclusion about Jesus. And the conclusion that they reach is there in verse 31. Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. Both Christ and Son of God are Old Testament words, Old Testament phrases, both referring to God's long-promised King. I think it took me quite a long time to realise this, but the amazing works that Jesus did didn't just take place in a vacuum. They weren't just random, one-off party tricks. They weren't just staggering, random miracles. Rather, they followed several hundred years of promises from God about a time he'd intervene. Let me just give you one example of that from John's Gospel to try and prove that point. Some 700 years before the birth of the Lord Jesus, the Lord had, through the prophet Isaiah, made a promise. A promise of a time when God would come to earth to save, a time of joy, a time of singing, a time of glory when God's character would be displayed. Quote, "Then the eyes of the blind shall be opened, and the ears of the deaf unstopped. Then shall the lame man leap like a deer, and the tongue of the mute sing for joy. Okay, that's what Isaiah says. Now let me just read out to you what Jesus does in John chapter 5. After this, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool in Aramaic called Bethesda, which has 5 roofed colonnades. Note the kind of detail there. In these lay a multitude of invalids, blind, lame, paralysed. One man was there who had been an invalid for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he had already been there a long time, he said to him, "Do you want to be healed?" The sick man answered him, "Sir, I have no one to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up, and while I'm going down, another steps down before me." Jesus said to him, "Get up, take your bed, and walk." And at once the man was healed, and he took his bed and walked. Do you see the point? Do you see the significance of what Jesus is doing? The Lord had promised it, Jesus did it. Isaiah prophesied it, Jesus fulfilled it. Somebody I know well speaks of the Lord Jesus as the only man in history whose biography was written before his birth. It was promised, all of this stuff. That's why John can speak of Jesus' signs. They signal stuff about him. They announce that he's divine. They reveal his true authority. They make plain that Jesus is God's King. You see, the Christian faith is not only faith that is grounded entirely in evidence. It's a faith all about the identity of one person. It's a faith that this man Jesus is God's King. And so as we close, I'd just like really to try and turn this question on its head and to suggest, perhaps slightly cheekily, that actually we all have some degree of faith when it comes to the identity of Jesus. You see, the atheist might say that Jesus is a fraud, that he's a maniac, he's a bad man, he's only worth ignoring. Now, if I've described you, I guess, you're entitled to that opinion, but that is a faith position, isn't it? That is your belief about the identity of Jesus. A belief in spite of every bit of evidence, I'd suggest. It's a belief that really is just a leap in the dark. The agnostic person, we'd agree, is a person who also has faith. They might believe that Jesus is not God's son and so think that the options are still open. They might believe that we can never know God, and so what Jesus claims about himself must be fictitious. But the question we must surely ask is whether our faith is accurate. Is our faith just a surrender of the mind? Is it a cop-out? Just unreasonable? Peter Singer? As a Christian, I would say that the Christian faith is not. Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. The evidence shows him to be so. And the offer is of life for those who will believe it. Verse 31, true life for all eternity. What better time to look at all the evidence? What better time to consider it? These things are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. Well, thanks for taking the time to listen and join us this lunchtime, either here in person or I know a number are watching online. I'm just going to end now with a couple of ways that you might like to follow up from the kind of things that we've been thinking about. The first way would be to just read a copy of John's Gospel. In many ways, that would be the best place to start. You can read for yourself all of the evidence. You can consider it as an adult. You could find a copy of John's Gospel either at the back if you're here in person, or you could find one online. And if you do that, feel free to get in touch with any questions. We'd love to help you think about the big questions that Jesus' teaching raises. So I strongly commend reading a copy of the Gospel for yourself. The second thing would be to join us on one of our Christianity Explored courses. You'll see from the handout, we've got one coming up, 3 Monday lunchtimes starting on November the 2nd. Christianity Explored, just a great chance to ask questions, any question, a chance to discuss things further, and you can sign up on our website for that. I'm going to draw things to a close there. If you are a regular watching online, we're not going to have our usual Zoom discussion this week, but we are going to leave the meeting open. So if you'd like to catch up with others who are on the call, we'll leave the meeting open for a little while to allow you to do that. Thanks so much for joining us this lunchtime. Next week, we're going to continue in our series on the Sermon on the Mount, and we hope to see you again very soon.